Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. We have made it through Tech Week by the skin of our teeth and have had one weekend of successful shows at my community theater. To say I've been busy, well, you probably guessed that by the missing episode last week. I do apologize, but as a stage manager, my brain can only handle so much. This upcoming weekend is the last runs of the show, and then I start into my next production, like Monday. Theater. Once you get bitten by the bug, you'll never want to leave. We hit some absolutely disgusting low temperatures over the last 2 weeks, like minus 42 degrees Celsius with wind chill. Just saying it makes me want to throw up. And where I am in Ontario, there are still 6 or 7 foot drifts on the side of the road. We got completely dumped on, and some of my friends were snowed in for a few days. Thank God I have neighbors with snowblowers. But luckily now the snow is starting to melt and the temperatures are starting to rise. I think we're going to hit -5 today. Woohoo! Only a true Canadian would appreciate that. It's almost time to pull out my flip-flops. I love flip-flops. I wear flip-flops as often as I possibly can. Love, love, love them. Anyways, that's about it from my little corner of Ontario. Let's get the business out of the way, shall we? If you like this episode or any episode, please head on over to the Patreon page and give the show some love. For less than a coffee crisp and a cup of tea, you can help me keep bringing you crime cases each week. And if you don't know what a coffee crisp is, you are missing out. It is a Canadian staple in the chocolate bar industry. You can also support the show on Spotify, and don't forget to give the show a 5-star review over on Apple. Apparently, it helps the show in the baffling algorithm. Like, follow, and share the show on whatever platform you're listening to. Stop by our Facebook page and leave a comment or share a post with everyone you know, or don't know for that matter. Everyone is welcome here. That's enough of the business. Let's get to this week's case. Before we begin this week's case, I would like to acknowledge that the specific area of Canada that we will be discussing this week, the Wells Grey Park, is located on the unceded traditional territory of the, and I'm so sorry and apologize for my horrible pronunciation of these words, the unceded traditional territory of the Simqua and Chesken First Nations, both being part of the Secwepemc Nation. And again, I apologize. The dogs are sleeping behind me, so puppy ASMR will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper this week. So grab a cup of tea, grab a shot for that cuppa, because we are dealing with a true Canadian shit pig monster this week. Sit back and relax while I tell you about the Wells Grey Park murders. As always, I want to give the victims in this case top billing. George, Edith, Jackie, Bob, Janet, and Karen. And to all Bentley Johnson family members and loved ones, I acknowledge you and send my love to you wherever you may be. A family camping trip in the Canadian wilderness. The image conjures up visions of clear night skies ablaze with stars, the symphony of crickets and rustling leaves, the comforting crackle of a campfire. A family huddled together at the end of an adventure-filled day, roasting marshmallows, sharing stories, and basking in the warmth of togetherness amidst Canada's breathtaking landscapes. It's a scene of idyllic peace and connection. But what happens when that peace is shattered? What happens when that pristine image is defiled by the intrusion of pure evil? A heinous killer lurking in the shadows, an unseen predator waiting for the opportune moment to strike. It sounds like the chilling tagline of a forgotten 80s horror flick. But in August of 1982, this scenario wasn't a movie. It was a horrifying and tragic reality. The details of this sickening and gruesome mass murder offers to the public a profound level of disturbance and chilling depravity, leaving behind a scene that haunts the mind. Amidst the chaos and fear that befell the Bentley Johnson family that summer night in 1982, a dark silhouette disappeared, swallowed by the dense, unforgiving woods, defined by a chilling lack of empathy, manipulative charm, and a terrifying propensity for violence. That dark silhouette represents a disturbing deviation from the norms of human behavior. The case of the Bentley Johnson family serves as a stark reminder that the idyllic beauty of the wilderness can be a deceptive facade. Behind the tranquil beauty, shadows can lurk, harboring motivations beyond comprehension. While the vast majority of camping trips result in cherished memories, the chilling reality remains that, in rare and devastating instances, the tranquility can be shattered by the emergence of a true evil. British Columbia, one of my most favorite places in the world to go. Downtown Vancouver is an absolute pleasure to explore. In Vancouver, you literally walk out of the mall and you are staring at the Rocky Mountains. It is amazing. Whistler is another favorite spot of mine. As you ride up the mountain in the cable car, you might just be lucky enough to see the family of bears that lives below. Sometimes they will wander out and wave hi up at the cable car. Once you reach the top of Whistler, the sheer beauty is breathtaking. The peaks, the snow, the air is invigorating, and the pink snow is a sight to see. Yes, there is pink snow on top of Whistler Mountain. The pink snow, or watermelon snow as some people call it, is formed by a type of algae that blooms in cold conditions, and at high altitudes it produces a red pigment called astaxanthin and appears pink on the snow. It is a beautiful thing to see. If you ever have the opportunity to head out to BC, I highly suggest you go. Our case this week takes place in Wells Grey Park in British Columbia. It is also called the Waterfall Park because there are 41 named waterfalls inside the park. Wells Grey is the 5th largest park inside BC. It covers 5,415 square kilometers, or 1.3 million acres. And that is just our 5th largest park inside that province. You would never be able to see the entire thing in one lifetime, and there are 4 that are bigger than that. Wells Grey Park is located in the interior of BC, very close to the border with Alberta. The park contains extinct volcanoes, waterfalls, as well as many springs and glaciers. A wonderful place to explore the beauty of Canada. Wells Grey Park was established in 1939 and was named for the Honourable Arthur Wellesley Grey, who at the time was the Minister of Lands for British Columbia. Wellesley Grey was from New Westminster, BC, another beautiful town I've been to. He died from a heart ailment in 1944, and a fellow cabinet minister said this of him after his passing, quote, "No man ever had a greater interest in his own town than he had in New Westminster, and everywhere you look in the royal city, you see a monument to something he has accomplished there. A quiet, lovable man, he will be greatly missed by the thousands who knew him." Unquote. Now there are some who say he enjoyed a drink or 8, and sometimes found himself in a bit of trouble here and there. but point out one person in Canada who hasn't had one too many wobbly pops and gotten themselves into a situation of potential trouble. We've all been there. So basically, Arthur was a decent guy. In 1982, George and Edith Bentley had been retired for 3 years, and like many Canadians, had enjoyed traveling and camping their way across this great nation of ours. They had rented out their home in Coquitlam, BC, and when they weren't out traveling, they would stay with one of their 3 grown children, Brian, Jackie, and Sharon. At the time of this case, George was 66 and Edith was 59. George and Edith loved spending time with their grandchildren when they weren't out camping, and they also enjoyed camping with their family as well. In August of 1982, George and Edith were excited. They were going to be trying out a new campground, Wells Gray Park, which had been recommended by a friend, and they were going to meet up at Wells Gray Park to spend a couple of weeks with their daughter Jackie, who was 41, and her husband Bob, who was 44, and their 2 children, Janet, 13, and Karen, 11. Bob and Jackie Johnson had been married for 21 years. Bob was a sawyer at Gorman Mill, a sawmill lumber yard near Kelowna, BC. A sawyer is the person who cuts the large trees once they have been cut down and pulled out of the forest. Bob was known for being a practical joker and always having a good time with friends and family. He loved his old extra stock beer. It was his beverage of choice. It's a beer that is or was quite popular in the western provinces of Canada. At one point it was made by Carling, but I believe O'Keefe took it over. So if you can still get it out west, enjoy. Jackie was a homemaker and a devoted mom. She doted on her girls and loved spending time with her family. She made sure her girls got to their guide meetings and piano lessons. Jackie loved photography and was somewhat an amateur photog. It's said that her family had become accustomed to having to pose for her, so she could get the perfect shots. Janet and Karen were buddies. They loved going to girl guides and both studied the piano. They had been raised in a loving home with lots of laughter and taught the importance of family. The girls loved their grandparents and were excited for the camping trip with George and Edith, mainly because they would go berry picking with their grandpa, and then their grandma would bake beautifully fresh, homemade berry pies for everyone to enjoy around the campfire at night. The last time any member of the Bentley Johnson family was heard from was on August 6th, when Edith called her daughter Sharon from a Chamber of Commerce phone. Edith told Sharon that she and George were having fun and that she had gone berry picking and was planning to whip up some of those pies for when they met up with Bob and Jackie and the girls. Edith told Sharon she and George were heading out soon to Wells Gray Park, and they should arrive about the same time as Bob, Jackie, and the girls. George was really excited to try out the new toy he had purchased, a 1981 Ford Camper Special, which is one of those pickup trucks with the camper attached over the bed, and a 10-foot aluminum boat. George secured the boat to the top of the camper, and when Edith was finished with the check-in call with Sharon, he and Edith set off to Wells Gray. Once everyone arrived at Wells Gray Park, the family decided on an out-of-the-way site called Old Bear Creek Prison Site. It was a little farther away from other sites in the park, but it offered the family an opportunity to be together and not have to have too much interaction with others in the park. The site was called this because Bear Creek Prison used to sit actually on that campsite. Bear Creek Prison was actually a mobile prison, which means it was a building that could be easily taken apart and moved to where it was needed most. The prison itself had been moved years before, but it had left behind a flat area, perfect for camping, and there was a creek nearby to the site, perfect for family fishing trips. By August 23rd of 1982, Bob had not reported for work at the mill. His manager, Al Bonar, was worried. Bob was due back to work on August 16th from his vacation, and there had been no call from Bob or Jackie. And Bob hadn't missed a day of work in the 20 years he was at the mill. So Al notified the RCMP and reported Bob Johnson as missing. The RCMP did some preliminary investigation, and when it was discovered that the entire family was missing, they were all placed in the system as missing. Police spoke with the family and found out that their missing members were camping at Wells Gray Park. Police began speaking with anyone they could find that had been at the park during the time that the family was supposed to have been there. A park employee remembered seeing the camper truck and the Plymouth, the Johnsons' car, at the old Bear Creek prison site. When police arrived at the campsite where the family had been set up, they found 2 sharpened sticks for roasting marshmallows, a few beer caps of Bob's favorite beer in the fire pit, along with 22 caliber shell casings, and 4 bottles of old extra stock tied to a tree and sitting just below the water of the creek to keep cold. This is a very Canadian thing to do. We used to tie the 6-pack of cans to the end of the canoe on May 24 when we go on our big river trip. This way the beer stayed cold, and if the OPP boat happened to come upon us, we could easily cut the line and drop the beer into the river. Don't boat and drink, kids. We were teenagers at the time, and it was back in the 80s, so, you know. Plus, we could always go back later and swim down to get the beer after the OPP officers had left. The 80s. From the evidence found at the campsite, the RCMP determined that it was a murder scene. But that was a tidbit they would hold back from the public. A search party was organized to search the park, and Jackie's brother Brian and his wife Linda started handing out missing posters. But remember, Wells Gray Park is the 5th largest park in BC. So needless to say, it wasn't going to be easy to search 1.3 million acres of land for some trace of the Bentley Johnson family. Eventually, the media picked up the story of an entire family gone missing inside Wells Gray Park, and the story started gaining traction. A Petro-Canada gas station attendant named Reg Bedard remembered seeing George and Jackie with both the girls at the gas station. They had filled up Jackie's car, and George had asked Reg if there were any good spots close by to pick berries. But this station was 40 miles east of Clearwater. Clearwater is a small town right on the borders of the park. It seems odd to me that they would be that far out of the park to pick berries. But nevertheless, this lead prompted a massive search of the south-central areas of BC. But sadly, no trace of anyone from the family was found. On September 13th, a man named Kirk Crack, which could be one of the best names in history of the world ever, remembered seeing a car sitting in the woods, and it was totally burnt to a crisp near Battle Mountain Road inside Wells Gray Park. Battle Mountain Road is just 20 miles from where the family had set up camp. Kurt Crack had been out picking mushrooms when he came upon the burnt-out car. He reported what he saw to the RCMP when he saw a news report about the missing family. And I would just like to know, what kind of mushrooms were you out in BC picking, Kurt Crack? Stop thinking that. I'm sure it was just wild mushrooms. Nothing of the hallucinogenic sort. To describe Battle Mountain Road to you, I would say this is a horse trail, more so than a road. It would be a tight squeeze to maneuver a car down this trail, but it could be done. Kurt Crack said that the car was sitting a piece down the trail and was sort of hidden by a bunch of trees. RCMP officers, led by Sergeant Michael Eastham, went out to investigate, and following Kurt's directions, the officers came upon Bob and Jackie's burnt-out car about 150 feet in from the main park road. Although it had only been a little over a month since the family had gone missing, the moisture from the forest had caused the Johnsons' car to rust considerably, and at first glance, one would think that the car had been in the dense woods for about 20 years. But there was a 20-foot circle of scorched earth surrounding the car, which is what told the investigators that the car had recently been burned. Once they were able to confirm the license plates on the car were in fact those of the Johnson family 1979 cream-colored Plymouth, the officers slowly and carefully approached the car. The fire that had incinerated the car had burned so hot that the door handles on the car had melted. The roof had melted into a concave shape. I will post a picture of the car. The driver's door had been left open. When Eastman and his officers looked through the windows of the car, they could clearly see human bones piled haphazardly in the back seat. Eastman made his way around the car to the trunk. There he found 5 keys on a ring hanging from the lock. The mechanism inside the car to open the trunk had been burned beyond use, so Eastman grabbed a pry bar and forced the trunk open. As the lid popped, his blood ran cold. Inside were more bones and 2 small skulls sitting on top of the pile of bones, looking directly at him. One of the small skulls in the trunk had what appeared to be an exit bullet hole over their left eye socket, which indicated that what was most likely a child, based on the size of skull, had been shot in the back of the head. In the second small skull, police found a bullet lodged inside. Officer Eastman called in pathologist Dr. McNaughton to come and pronounce the victims as deceased and to collect the remains. McNaughton and his team collected 50 small plastic bags of bones and cremated remains from inside the car. Along with the remains, authorities found a lady's wristwatch, 2 heart-shaped pieces of a single locket, a set of rings, a gold family ring with 5 stones, a gold band with a diamond, a medic alert bracelet, and a melted belt buckle. So just from the inventory from inside the burned car, I think we can safely assume that robbery was not a motive here. There is no way a thief would have left gold rings and precious stones on the bodies and then burned them. At first, RCMP thought that they had found Bob, Jackie, Janet, and Karen, and that George and Edith were still missing. But sadly, once McNaughton had processed all the remains from the car, he was able to determine that not only was the entire Johnson family inside the car, but so were Edith and George. He was able to identify Bob, Jackie, Janet, and Karen from dental records. But George and Edith both wore dentures, and they had melted in the fire. But with the amount of bones and the reassembling of those bones and the amount of cremated remains, McNaughton was more than certain that all 4 adults and the 2 girls were inside that car when it was burned. One of the adult skulls also had a .22 caliber bullet inside it, the same as one of the girls' skulls. Later, investigators would determine that the adult skull with the bullet was that of Edith. McNaughton was unable to determine an actual cause of death for any of the people who were found inside that car. The bodies had suffered too much damage in the fire. But he was able to say with some level of certainty that the bullet holes in the skulls were caused by a .22 caliber weapon, possibly a Ruger over-under shotgun. All 6 members of the Bentley Johnson family were buried together in one grave in Lakeview Memorial Gardens in Kelowna, BC. Horrific. Absolutely fucking horrific. The thing about Canada is that the land area of our great country is so large and so heavily wooded that many of our loved ones who go missing could be inside a forest somewhere and they will never be found, except by happenstance. And thankfully, Kirk Crack was out picking mushrooms in September and stumbled across the car, or we may never have known what actually happened to the Bentley Johnson family. RCMP immediately put out a bolo, a be on the lookout for the truck and camper belonging to George and Edith, as it was still missing. Media outlets across the country ran numerous spots per day highlighting the details of the missing truck, and the investigators conducted numerous press conferences pleading for the public's help to find the missing vehicle. This case garnered national attention, and lots of it. You see, we have what is called the Trans-Canada Highway here, and this highway literally runs from coast to coast of our country. And since we have no borders between our provinces or territories, theoretically, one could drive and camp their way across this beautiful country. Or a person could hit the highway and, say, be out of an area where they committed a heinous mass murder. The Trans-Canada Highway is 7,821 kilometers, or 4,860 miles long, with lots of areas to pull off and hide. RCMP received a tip that the camper had been spotted in Saskatchewan, heading east and being driven by 2 Frenchmen. The caller stated that they had been following the camper along the Trans-Canada Highway, and both had pulled in at a service station for gas and food. The caller described them as 2 young men in their 20s with shoulder-length hair, one brown, one blonde. They were both shabbily dressed and both spoke French fluently and had difficulty with English. As well, there were BC plates on the camper. Because of this detailed tip, the authorities assumed that Quebec was where these 2 Frenchmen driving the camper were headed. So police made several public appeals for any information on the 2 Frenchmen or the camper. Having 2 men as their suspects seemed plausible for authorities, as it would have been difficult to control 6 victims at once. Most of the investigation's focus was going towards these 2 Frenchmen driving a camper van somewhere along the Trans-Canada. But also during this time in the investigation, another tip came in. It was from the manager of an apartment building in Kelowna. According to the manager, there had been a truck illegally parked in his building for a couple of days. The manager was pissed because this truck was actually parked in his own personal parking spot. So in his anger, he had written down the license plate because he was going to get it towed. When he saw the press conference with the description of the truck and camper and the license plate number for the truck, he realized that it was the same plate as what was on the truck in his parking spot. He called the tip line right away, but unfortunately, investigators seemed to have tunnel vision at this point and didn't believe this tip was credible. They wholeheartedly believed that the 2 Frenchmen were better suspects and that this guy was probably just trying to get his 15 minutes of fame. The truck that this guy was talking about didn't have a camper or a boat on it. Officers tried to get the apartment manager to take a polygraph, but he wasn't able to take one because he had a heart condition. Well, he could have taken a polygraph, but the readings wouldn't have been accurate because of the heart condition. So sadly, police ignored this tip completely. Police continued focusing on the Frenchman. They sent out over 50,000 form letters to people who might have been in the Wells Gray Park during the months of July and August, in case anyone had come into contact with the Frenchman. They asked anyone who was in the park during the specified time period to send any and all pictures that they had taken for closer inspection, in case there were people in the background that might be related to the murders. RCMP checked every parking ticket that had been issued in Canada, every prison escape, and every used auto parts dealer in case any instance or piece of the camper truck showed up. But by April of 1983, investigators still had nothing. There was just no trace of George and Edith's truck and camper. On May 9, 1983, an exact replica of George and Edith's camper truck pulled out of the RCMP garage in Kamloops, BC. It had been created to give people a visual of what exactly officers were looking for. The truck's destination was Montreal, and the officers driving the truck had been allotted 3 weeks to get there. Along the way, they were to stop and interview any witnesses that had called a tip in over the past few months. Let them see the truck replica and confirm or not confirmed if that was indeed the truck they had called about. Not only would this help to weed out mistaken identifications of the truck, but it would expose thousands of more people to the exact truck that was being sought. Personally, I think this is brilliant. A little expensive? Yeah, but seeing the actual truck might spark a memory for someone. There were also 2 officers that traveled ahead of the replica truck and held press conferences in towns along the route. If nothing else, it kept the case in the forefront of people's minds, which is exactly what you want in a case like this. In August of 1983, 1 year after the Bentley Johnson family was murdered, a mechanic in Windsor, Ontario, called in and stated that 3 or 4 months earlier, 2 Frenchmen had approached him and asked for a midnight paint job on their camper truck and offered to pay cash for the job. The mechanic had agreed to do the paint job, and when the Frenchmen brought the truck to him, they had removed the camper. The mechanic was able to describe in detail specific modifications that had been done to the truck that he painted. And those modifications matched exact modifications that George had done to his truck. The mechanic also told investigators that the 2 Frenchmen had asked if he knew how they could dispose of 2 weapons that they had in their truck. The mechanic stated that one of the weapons was a .22 caliber over-under Ruger rifle. And because I had no clue what the hell an over-under shotgun was, I went to the magic Google box and found out that an over-under shotgun is a shotgun with 2 barrels, and those barrels are stacked on top of each other vertically. The more you know. The mechanic told the Frenchman that he didn't want anything to do with any of the weapons as he had a record, but instead he gave them the name of a guy over the border in Detroit that would be willing and able to help them out. Can we just stop for a second? Why the fuck would you refuse to help these 2 guys to dispose of weapons because you don't want to get in trouble, but you're willing to give them the name of someone who will help? Dude, check your values. While the investigators were seriously following the lead of the 2 Frenchmen in a camper truck somewhere out on the Trans-Canada Highway, back at Wells Gray Park, RCMP were still having air searches of the park conducted looking for the camper truck. Officer Eastman stated in his book that he had a feeling that the camper truck had never left the park, even though there were all these tips coming in to the contrary. On October 18, 1983, 2 Wells Gray forest rangers came across the camper truck at the 4,700-foot level of Trophy Mountain, a mountain inside Wells Gray Park. The truck was only about halfway up Trophy Mountain, as the mountain itself is about 9,000 feet high. The truck was only 20 kilometers from the murder site and about 30 kilometers from where the Johnsons' car was located. Just an interesting note here about the 3 areas of the park that this case covers. If you were to look at a map of Wells Gray Park, Old Bear Creek Prison, where the campsite was, Battle Mountain, where the car and bodies were found, and Trophy Mountain, where the truck was found, form almost a complete and perfect triangle. The truck had been driven along the main road inside the park and then had turned off onto a logging road. For those of you who don't know what a logging road is, it's literally an unpaved trail road that is used to access the dense forests that are being logged. They are not a place that you should really drive your car. These roads are used by huge 18-wheeler log trucks, think Final Destination, and heavy machinery that is used for clearing. Once on the logging road, the truck had become stuck on a big log sticking out of the road, and just up the logging road a few more miles there was a large canyon. Eastman figured that that was the intended destination for the truck. If the killer or killers had managed to drive the truck into that canyon, it would never have been found. As well, the actual camper and the boat were not with the truck. Someone had removed them. The fact that the truck was found on this logging road indicated that whoever drove it there was most likely local, because no one other than those from the area would have even known about its existence. A logging road is literally a dirt road that has been created by a truck driving over it over and over again to get into the forests. These roads, they're not on maps for someone to look up. The burnt-out remains of the truck had also rusted from the moisture in the forest, and when that was added to the fire that destroyed the vehicle, the truck itself had almost blended in with the forest and the foliage surrounding it. As well, the foliage and forest had begun to absorb the truck by growing through the carcass of the truck and over it, which is why it was never seen during any of the air searches over the park. Just to give you an idea of how well camouflaged this truck was, about 15 feet from the truck, a forestry worker had planted new seedling trees and hadn't noticed the truck. And there was a $7,500 reward for finding the truck. So whichever worker was planting those seedlings would have definitely called in the tip if they had seen it, just for the money alone. When investigators searched the camper truck, the only piece of evidence they found was a .22 caliber bullet hole in the passenger side door, and the truck had been burned the same as the Johnsons' car. There was nothing else. Because the investigators felt as though the killer or killers had to be local, they began an intense door-to-door investigation inside Clearwater and the areas surrounding Wells Gray Park. They still kept all the posters up and did their best to keep the case in the media, but it had been over a year since the murders. Then a call came into the tip line. The person suggested that the investigators take a look at a local man named David Shearing. According to the caller, Shearing had run over someone on the Wells Gray Park Road a couple of years earlier and had gotten away with it. The exact same day that this tip came into the office, one of the investigators came back to the office after having lunch at a restaurant in Clearwater with a small slip of paper. He walked up to Eastman, showed him the crinkled paper in his hand, and told Eastman that while he was having lunch at the restaurant, the waitress slid this piece of paper to him over the counter. She obviously didn't want anyone to know what she was doing. When the officer opened the paper up, the name David Shearing was written on it. Eastman immediately started looking into Shearing. David William Shearing was born on April 10, 1959, So that would make him what? Oh, a shit pig. And 23 years old at the time of the Bentley Johnson murders. He had grown up and still lived on a secluded 160-acre ranch a couple of miles from the Wells Gray Park. His father had been a prison guard at the Bear Creek Prison while Shearing was a little boy, but his father had passed away in 1982 from cancer. He had one sister and a brother, Greg, who had been a sheriff in the area. The Shearing family was considered a nice, upper-middle-class family. But David Shearing had, at some point, taken a wrong turn on his life path. He had a lengthy criminal record, which included drugs, assault, and drinking and driving. Looking into Shearing's social connections, many in the town of Clearwater described him as a weird loner type who liked to drink and fight. They also said he had an affliction for younger girls, like in the 13 to 14 years old range. So he is a shit pig. Eastman remembered that during the beginning stages of the investigation, officers had actually spoken with David Shearing during one of the door-to-door campaigns. According to the officer's notes on the interaction with Shearing, he had said that the murders were terrible and that the guilty people deserved what they got. He informed the officers that he didn't see or remember anything out of the ordinary during the time of the murders. Shearing had stated that he couldn't think of anyone he knew that would do such a thing, but he told the officers that he would call them if anything happened to pop into his mind, and with that, he wished them the best of luck in their investigation. This shit snake gave all the right answers not to raise suspicion. The officers that interviewed him labeled him in the file as a hometown cowboy who was a hard worker and liked to drink and fight, which really just fits in with about half the population of Canada. According to the file, Shearing would have had to have driven past the Bentley Johnson campsite twice a day to get to and from work. Eastman stated that he thought Shearing was looking like either a really good suspect or someone who had to have seen something. The very next day, after the phone tip and the waitress's slip of paper, an officer was conducting more door-to-door investigations. He was at a house with a wife and a husband, and during the questioning, the wife looked at her husband and said, "Aren't you going to tell them about what David Shearing said about re-registering that truck with the bullet hole in the door?" The wife then smiled sheepishly and excused herself from the room as her husband scowled at her back. "Oh, you know things weren't okay in that house that night." What a boss-ass thing to do. My guess is she didn't care too much for Shearing or for her husband hanging out with him, so when opportunity knocked on her door, she opened it. The officer who was conducting the questioning at the house ignored what the wife had said and pretended like he hadn't heard anything. He didn't want the husband contacting Shearing and giving him a heads up, and he wanted to get back to Eastman and tell him what the wife had said. Eastman had the house put under surveillance, and as soon as the husband left for work, officers went back to the house to question the wife without her husband. After speaking with the wife, they wanted to find Shearing, and quickly. After a few questions around town, they learned that Shearing was up in Tumbler Ridge working. Tumbler Ridge was about 600 miles north of Clearwater. On November 16, 1983, Eastman called fellow RCMP officer Ron German up in Tumbler Ridge and requested that German locate Shearing and to ensure that he didn't leave Tumbler Ridge. Eastman just happened to be in luck because Shearing was already in trouble up in German's neck of the woods. Shearing had been caught with a loaded shotgun and about $40,000 worth of tools stolen from a nearby logging camp in the back of his truck. German told Eastman that Shearing was scheduled to appear in court on the following Monday, and that upcoming weekend, Shearing and some buddies were headed into Dawson Creek for a last hurrah before facing the theft charges. Eastman requested that German bring in Shearing for interrogation, and German just happened to have a theft charge that he had been holding back for Shearing until the last hurrah in Dawson Creek, so he used that to bring Shearing in. Eastman immediately headed out for Tumbler Ridge. When Eastman walked into the interrogation room, he was met by a 6'3", 250-pound man with a mustache that was stained yellow from nicotine. Ooh! Oh, sorry, I just threw up in my mouth a little bit. Oh, I can't stand a man who doesn't look after their facial hair, and having it stained with nicotine is, oh, nope, I can't do that, nope. When asked if he knew why he was brought in, Shearing asked if they were investigating the Bentley Johnson murders. Okay, now I'm not the smartest person on this planet, but even I know that if you've done something and are brought in for interrogation, the first thing you don't do is ask if the cop sitting across from you is investigating the crime you committed. Dumbass. First, Eastman was able to get Shearing to admit to the hit and run that had, up until that point, been just a rumor in Clearwater. According to Shearing, he and his buddy, Doug Elliott, were out for a night of drinking, and somewhere along the Wells Gray Road, Shearing ran over a man named Dave Carter. Shearing stated that after he realized that Carter had been run over, he was too scared to stop and help him because Shearing and Elliott were both drunk. Okay, so you're not only a shit pig, you're an absolutely rotten human being. So we just all know what we're dealing with here. And by the way, Dave Carter, the victim, who was run over by Shearing, was actually a friend of theirs. Eastman had Shearing write out his confession to the hit and run, and the entire time Shearing was writing out his confession, he was crying and sobbing and snotting all over that interrogation room. And in my opinion, Shearing wasn't crying because Carter had been a friend of his and he killed him. It was because he had been caught. Eastman then asked Shearing if he knew where the Bentley Johnson murders had taken place. Shearing immediately answered with, "Oh yeah, at the old Bear Creek prison camp, right?" And this, ladies and gentlemen, could possibly be the stupidest man on our planet. The RCMP had never released that they had found the Bentley Johnson campsite, remember? They just let the media spread the info that where the Johnson car had been found was the murder site. Can we say, gotcha, you shit pig? Shearing instantly began to cry when he realized that he had just admitted to the Bentley Johnson murders. He continued confessing through his tears. He stated that the camper and boat and rifle that he used to murder the family was back at his ranch. He then drew a map of the campsite and pointed out where every person in the family was when he shot and killed them. He then detailed his moving of the vehicles to the spots where they were found and setting them both ablaze. According to Shearing, he told Eastman that he had seen the family on his way home from work one night and decided to take a walk through the woods. When he got to the campsite, he just stood hidden inside the forest and watched the family. The next thing he knew, it was the next night and he was carrying a shotgun, sneaking around the camper truck and began shooting. He shot the 4 adults as they sat around the campfire, and then he opened the zipper on the tent and shot the 2 girls inside. He said that night he piled the 4 adult bodies in the back seat of the car and the 2 girls' bodies in the trunk. He then went home for the night because he was tired from moving all the bodies. Shearing said he went back the next night and drove the car to Battle Mount, poured 5 gallons of gasoline all over the car and the bodies, and set it ablaze. He said he stood and watched the car burn for a while and then went home. A couple of days after that, he went back to the campsite and drove the camper truck back to his ranch, where he removed the camper and boat, hiding both of them with shrubbery and foliage on his property. Once that was done, he drove the truck to Trophy Mountain, and stated that he was going to drive the truck off the edge of the mountain and let it fall into the canyon, but the truck had gotten hung up on a giant log in the middle of the road, which was the only access to the canyon. And that, ladies and gents, was Shearing's entire confession to the Bentley Johnson murders. Do you smell that? I smell some horse shit here. So Shearing would have the RCMP believe that for absolutely no reason at all, and after watching the family for an entire night from the forest, he just grabbed a shotgun and decided to murder 6 people who didn't even know he existed? No, there has to be more to this than that. But that is the story that Shearing stuck to. Shearing was taken back to Clearwater, where he walked the RCMP through the murders and the cleanup of the campsite and the disposal of the camper truck, boat, and car. He walked the officers right to where he had both the camper and the boat hidden with brush and foliage on his ranch. Shearing then pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder. On April 16, 1984, Shearing was scheduled to enter his plea of guilty, but before he was taken into the courtroom, RCMP officer Eastham paid him a visit at his cell. Eastham told Shearing that he knew there was more to the story than just what he was admitting, and Shearing told Eastham that someday he might actually tell him, but it wasn't going to be that day. Eastham said he would be back for the whole story after Shearing received his sentence. During his appearance in court, while he entered his guilty pleas, the judge asked Shearing why he would commit such a heinous and horrific crime. Shearing had no response for the judge. Nothing. No words. Just like the shit snake pig he is. The very next day, the judge sentenced Shearing to 6 terms of life in prison to be served concurrently and no chance of parole until he had served a minimum of 25 years in prison. The day after sentencing, Eastham showed up at Shearing's cell and demanded the truth about what happened to the Bentley Johnson family. This was the confession that Shearing gave to Eastham that day. Now remember where this is coming from. A shit pig. One of the lowest forms of scum on this planet we will ever see. Not from any evidence or forensics or even good old-fashioned police work. This is all from the shit snake pig Shearing. According to Shearing, he saw the family at their campsite on his way home from work, and he decided to walk over and watch them from the woods. Once he got there, he saw the 2 little girls, Janet and Karen, and he became attracted to both of them. Shearing went home but returned the next night and watched the family again. He stated that he watched the family for a couple of nights. He had decided that in order to get to the girls, he would have to kill the adults, and there was no way around that. On about the 4th or 5th night, he went back to his place in the woods and watched the family. When he was certain that the girls were in the tent and asleep, he snuck down to the campsite with his rifle and silently made his way around the camper truck. One of the women, he wasn't sure which one, spotted him and started to stand up. Shearing yelled, "Don't move, I have a gun." Bob immediately stood to protect his family, and Shearing shot him in the throat. George started running for the passenger side of the truck because that was where he kept his gun, but just as George was reaching for the door of the truck, Shearing shot and killed him. Next, Jackie started running for the tent to try and save her girls, and Shearing shot her in the head before she was able to make it to the tent. Edith ran for the passenger side door of the truck, possibly to get the gun or just to try and put some metal between her and this insane killer. Shearing shot her in the head before she could reach the truck. Shearing then stated that he made his way over to the tent and opened it to find the 2 girls with wide eyes staring at him from their sleeping bags. He stated that the girls asked him what was going on. He told them that there was some very bad motorcycle men out there who were trying to hurt their parents and grandparents, and that their mom and dad had sent him to take care of them while they went for help. According to this fucking monster, the girls believed him, and when he told them to stay in the tent, they obeyed. He stated that he then went and had to shoot Bob again because he was still alive and gurgling. Once he was sure that Bob was dead, he moved all the bodies to the back seat of the car and covered them with a blanket. He then went back to the tent and viciously raped both girls. Once this vile piece of scum was finished, he brought both the girls out of the tent, and he stated that the girls willingly helped him clean up the campsite and load everything into the camper. He then placed both girls in the front seat of the car with him and drove to his ranch. He stated that the girls had no idea that their entire family was in the back seat, dead. Shearing said that when they reached the ranch, he had the girls set up their tent in the front yard of his house and get inside. He told them to stay inside no matter what because the bad motorcycle men were still in the area. He then walked back to the campsite and drove the camper truck to his property. He said that he kept the girls at the ranch for a few days and that he went back and forth to work and the girls just stayed at the house inside, but that he didn't have to tie them up or lock them in. They stayed because they believed that he was there to watch them while their parents were off trying to get help to scare away the bad motorcycle men. Shearing stated that he then told the girls that their parents were going to meet them at his fishing cabin in the woods and that they had to walk there because there were no roads to the cabin. This piece of shit claims he walked those girls through the forest all night until they reached the cabin. He claims that the night that they reached the cabin, the girls slept in one sleeping bag together and he in another, all by himself. Shearing stated that the next morning there were sounds outside of the cabin, and when he looked out through the window, there was a group of prisoners that had been brought out to fish the river. Shearing stated that there was then a knock on his door, and when he opened it, there was a prison guard standing there. The guard told Shearing that he had a group of prisoners out for a morning of fishing, but that there was nothing to worry about because the prisoners that were there were harmless. Shearing stated that while the guard was at the door, he had both the girls hiding behind it and out of sight. Later that day, after the guard had come to the door, Shearing and the girls headed back to the ranch on foot. Once they reached the ranch, Shearing asked Karen to go for a walk with him. She agreed, according to the shit snake. Shearing stated that once they had walked for a bit, he told Karen he had to pee. Karen turned around to give him his privacy while he peed behind a tree, but instead, Shearing stated that he had hidden the rifle behind the tree, and when Karen turned her back, he shot her in the back of the head. Shearing returned to the house, and when Janet asked where Karen was, he told her that he had tied Karen to a tree. That night, Shearing stated that he and Janet spent the night together inside the camper, just talking. Shearing stated that the day after their night of talking, he and Janet went for a walk together, and the same as Karen, he told Janet he had to pee, and when she turned around to give him his privacy, he again retrieved the rifle from a hiding spot and shot Janet in the head. And that is the confession that Shearing gave to Eastman after he had been sentenced to life in prison. Personally, I believe pieces of that confession, but I do not believe every word of it. I don't think that Shearing took both girls from the camp. I think he took one, most likely Janet, and murdered Karen the same night as the rest of the family. I think that he kept Janet alive and tortured her and abused her and raped her until he was satisfied, and then he murdered her. Somewhere between both of Shearing's versions of the mass murder lies the truth. Shearing is still alive to this day and still in prison. He has come up for parole, but thank God he has been denied every time he has applied for it. The latest that I could find was in 2021, where he was denied again. Since his conviction, Shearing has changed his name to David Ennis and married a woman he met while in prison. Her name is Heather Ennis, and she has been his wife for 18 years now. At the last parole hearing, she informed reporters that the two have a great marriage and that, quote, "I have seen so much change in this man since we met in 1993. I know the man's heart is in the right place, and I'm just here to back him up," unquote. I really think Heather is deluded. At the 2021 parole hearing, Shearing offered his first sign of remorse since the murders. Quote, "My crime was an enormous, brutal, and inexcusable tragedy, resulting in tremendous loss to the community that I can never make up for. It makes me hate to be in my own skin," unquote. I hate your skin too, Shearing, and your stupid face, and well, I hate all of you. Officer Eastman has kept in contact with the Bentley Johnson families. He states in his book that his job is not over until Shearing, or Ennis, dies in prison. And that, my friends, is the case of the Wells Gray Park murders. My thoughts. There is no way that those two little girls stayed inside that tent and obeyed Shearing after hearing their parents and grandparents screaming and being murdered right outside. I think that the girls ran and Shearing either caught one and murdered the other or caught them both. But I honestly don't think Shearing kept Karen alive. I think he killed her on the same night that he killed the rest of her family. He wanted Janet. She was 13, and that was the same age that the rumors in town said that he had an affiliation for. The reason that I think that Janet was kept alive and not Karen is because Eastman confirmed with the prison guard that he had knocked on Shearing's cabin door and spoken with Shearing that day. As well, when investigators found the cabin, Shearing had carved the initials DS plus JJ into the wall of the bedroom. David Shearing and Janet Johnson. I think that poor angel Janet went through pure hell for however many days he kept her alive. Personally, I don't feel that a monster like Shearing should be given the privilege of meeting a woman and marrying her. And because they are married, they're entitled to conjugal visits on a regular basis, which means they get to go and stay in a trailer for a weekend or 4 or 5 days, however long the visits are, and play house together like they're some kind of normal married couple. I'm so sorry, but there has to be some mental health issues with this woman. Any woman who could marry a monster that could brutally murder an entire family, And they shouldn't be allowed to get married. They shouldn't be allowed to have conjugal visits. He should have absolutely no pleasure in his life of any kind. You know why? Because none of the Bentley Johnson family members that are left have any pleasure in their life. Every single day they deal with the pain of what happened to their loved ones. There are just some crimes that can't be forgiven. And in cases as horrific as this one, I wish that Canada still had the death penalty. Members of the Bentley Johnson family have been in attendance for every single one of Shearing's parole hearings, and they plan on carrying that on until he dies in prison. They also started an online petition to keep Shearing in prison prior to his 2008 parole hearing, which received over 100,000 signatures. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Shearing will be able to apply for parole again this year. Whether he does or not is something we'll have to wait and see. I will try and keep an eye on this case, and if another petition is created by the Bentley Johnson family, I will post it on the Facebook page. For the family of George, Edith, Bob, Jackie, Janet, and Karen, Shearing is just a waste of a body, and I, for one, wholeheartedly agree with them. Whew, that was a tough one. What an absolute shit pig asshole this guy is. I pray that he is never granted parole. He's never shown remorse or apologized for what he did. He wiped out 3 generations of one family in one night. He should never be allowed to feel the same freedom that the rest of us do. And with that, I think we'll leave it there for this week. Stay safe, get your pap test done, and enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.